I think we'll make a start. There probably will be a few more people joining as we carry on. Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for attending this webinar, hosted by the Institute for Global City Policing, but actually really a co-production with all the parties you see on the agenda for today. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Welcome wherever you are in the world. I mean, even on the panel, we've got, I think, a 13-hour difference in time zones represented among the panelists. And I think there are people joining from the US and UK and all over as well. My name is Ben Bradford. I'm Director of the Institute for Global City Policing. Our topic today, as you will have seen, is organisational justice and police reform, and we're reporting on an evaluation conducted by ourselves and the Vera Institute of two police departments in 2018 to 2019, Arlington in Texas and West Midlands Police in the UK. I'm not going to say any more about the actual project because that's going to be introduced to you in some depth as we go for the seminar. But what I will do is take this opportunity at the beginning to say thanks to everyone involved. It was a pleasure to work with everyone on this project. It was a genuine piece of co-production. And that ranged from really great engagement from Open Society Foundation, who were the funders, obviously great collaboration between us at UCL and the Vera Institute in New York, but particularly huge thanks to the two police departments involved, Arlington and West Midlands, not only for the access and the time that they gave to us during this research, but actually their engagement in the research itself. And it was hugely useful and hugely rewarding for us to work really closely with two police departments on something that, of course, remains something of a controversial issue in the US and the UK and much further afield as well. So we're really grateful to all participants for making this happen. You'll have seen the schedule, you've seen the agenda. I'm going to run this hopefully on a fairly tight ship basis. We've got quite a few presentations. Everyone's been briefed, so hopefully we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose your questions as we go along. I will collate those and then put those to an open panel at the end. So we'll be doing that hopefully around quarter past 5 UK time. If your question is aimed at anyone in particular, please put their name in the question and I'll field it to the right person. If it's a general question, just leave it open and I will field that question to the panel as a whole. Right, I think that means that the panelists can turn their video off so they don't have to stare at themselves while they're not talking. And our first speaker is Rachel Neal from the Open Society Foundation, Senior Program Advisor. I think I got that right, Rachel. And she's going to introduce, I guess, why we're doing the research in the first place. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Ben. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And to see the fruition of this work and the report coming out. Let me just say, I work with Open Society Justice Initiative, which is an operational part of the Open Society Foundations, which is a global philanthropy supporting democracy, rule of law, human rights in regions across the world. And police reform, policing, public security, it's been a major concern of Justice Initiative, but also of colleagues of ours in many, many different regions. And we've had very active debates about procedural justice. I think for many of us who have long worked on reforms in the justice sector, the insights that how work is done is just as important as the outcome. That trust and legitimacy can be broken through poor process has been an incredibly compelling one. It's provided some real intellectual, theoretical grounding to the values of due process that we often see posited as a trade-off. If you want security, sometimes you cannot have all the rights you wish, is a frequent argument that's put forward. And procedural justice theory just provides this incredibly compelling vision of why that is not so, and of the costs of losing trust and legitimacy as an organization to effectiveness and indeed to ability to then guarantee the security that is the mission of those organizations. We also have had a very active debate for some years under Chris Stone as our executive director about theories of change and how outsiders can best support reforms in the policing and criminal justice sector. And Chris was very skeptical about how far reforms can be taken through external pressure, and particularly through litigation, which has been a very common approach in the United States, especially, but growing in other parts of the world. That really fundamentally, to change the way policing happens and to correct anything that is going wrong there, you have to look internally at the culture of organizations. So we were trying to think in work that I was doing with Rebecca Del Sol, my colleague, on racial or ethnic profiling by police in Europe, about how to bring these insights to some kind of practical application with the different police departments that we were collaborating with. And we did several exchange visits where we brought senior US police managers and chiefs to the UK, and prior to that we had brought senior British police managers to the US to really support a conversation between some of the people who were having the most interesting and forward-looking conversations in the field about procedural justice, but about other matters as well, how to basically reduce bias and discriminatory outcomes in policing. And when we went to the UK, we visited West Midlands, and we're incredibly impressed at the organisational change underway in that police department. I think around the same time, I met Tracy Mears as well at a talk she was giving at Vera Institute in New York, and was asking about the challenges of operationalizing procedural justice to improve the quality and outcomes of individual encounters with members of the public. And Tracy said, you know, I really don't think that's the way to go. We have to back up and we have to look at organizational justice. And we need to see the values in an organization in its own self-management and the way it does business, if we're truly to see those values also then reflected in public relations and in individual encounters. And it was really coming out of those two development, those conversations, the visits, that recommendation from Tracy, that we decided that we should support this research into two departments, one in the UK and one in the US, who have really taken this insight, this theory of Tom Tyler's and others on board, and tried to operationalize it in their own practice. And we're enormously grateful to both Arlington, Texas and West Midlands for opening up and sharing their process and insights with the terrific researchers who came on board to do this. And I just want to close by saying we just couldn't have had any better partners to actually do this research. And I really want to thank the Institute for Global Cities Policing, sorry, Ben, Zoha, Jyoti, and Maria. And Vera, Caroline, Anna, Abdul, Jason, and Rebecca for all the terrific work they've put into this, and looking forward to hearing the research now.
Thanks very much, Rachel. It's a far, far better summary than I could have done. I'm glad I left it to you. Now I get to say all the things I forgot to say at the beginning. Well, actually, it's just one thing. This is being recorded, which doesn't make a huge difference to the attendees, of course, in terms of recording your face or your voice. But that doesn't mean we can make the recording available afterwards, and we will do so. We'll post that to the JDI YouTube website, and you'll all receive a link. Right, now straight over to Anna Steenkamp, who's started talking through the process of the research itself. Anna is a research fellow at the Vera Institute for Justice, and she tells me just today a doctoral candidate at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Anna, over to you.
Great, thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Well, good morning from me where I am. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to be talking about what our findings from Arlington, Texas were during this evaluation. So 2 brief definitions I want to go over before diving in is how we define procedural and organizational justice. Procedural justice focuses on external attitudes and whether the community views the police as treating them with respect, giving them voice, are neutral in their decisions, and trustworthy, leading them to view police as legitimate. Organizational justice is whether employees view the department as being fair, trustworthy, treat them with respect, as well as giving them voice along the same dimensions as procedural justice, but from the organization itself. And organizational justice has gained more attention in the past few years, as Rachel mentioned, as on the importance of officers to view their own department as legitimate as a way to increase buy-in for implementing procedural justice reforms, as well as the belief that when, if the organization treats officers fairly, they will then in turn treat the community fairly as well. So the main research question of this comparative evaluation was whether the organizational justice reforms implemented within Arlington and West Midlands were implemented and accepted by officers in that department. And we defined acceptance as mentioning the reforms in our interviews and during our data collection. So a little bit of background about Arlington, Texas. For those that don't know, it is right outside of Dallas, Fort Worth, which is a major airline or airport hub. In 2019, they had about almost 400,000 people living in Arlington. The number of officers within the department at the time of this evaluation was 673. And one key aspect that we identified during this evaluation was that they have only had 4 police chiefs since 1985, which is rare for the US, and I'll go into a bit more detail later on. So a bit of background on how organizational justice reforms began in Arlington goes back to 2005 with a visit from Dr. Tom Tyler, who discussed the importance of procedural justice to improve the community's trust in the police. This began the process of implementing reforms that were designed to enhance procedural justice in the community, as well as some reforms for organizational justice in the department. And when Chief Will Johnson was hired in 2013, he expanded and implemented numerous reforms with the goal of improving perceptions of fairness within the department. However, many of the reforms implemented focused on perceptions of procedural justice within the community and appeared to have a bit less of a focus on improving fairness within the department as was originally desired. And our data collection for this began in 2019 and ended in beginning of last year, so 2020. For this evaluation, the Vera researchers conducted 18 interviews and focus groups with a total of 30 members of Arlington Police Department, ranging from rank and file to upper management. And during 2 site visits in 2019, we observed rideouts, academy training courses, supervisor meetings, defensive tactics presentations, and police operations of public events. We also conducted a document review of various administrative documents that were provided to us by Arlington to compare information discussed in the interviews and focus groups with official policies and practices. So we identified 5 key areas with the Arlington Police Department that had implemented reforms over the past several years to see if they had been implemented and accepted. So these 5 areas were training, recruitment, promotions, internal affairs, and defensive tactics. For training, Arlington has implemented a procedural justice class for their new recruits since 2016. They've also integrated this training into annual in-service training or in-service classes for the rest of the department. So all of the department is receiving classes about procedural and organizational justice. And elements of procedural and organizational justice have been incorporated into other trainings, although they may not be explicitly mentioned, the themes are common throughout. So this can include classes such as ethics, fair and impartial policing, and cultural diversity. Arlington has also made specific efforts to recruit traditionally underrepresented racial, ethnic, and gender identities with the belief that a more diverse workforce would enhance perceptions of procedural justice in the community. Participants frequently mentioned that they believe the four-year degree requirement for new recruits helped create a better officer, as well as the high starting salary of roughly $65,000 may also speak to to a bit of a selection bias. So who is deciding to apply for the Arlington Police Department is a bit different than who may be applying for other departments across the US. So they have not experienced the same challenges as many other departments across the United States in terms of number of applicants and recruits. The hiring process has also changed to shift to focus on individuals who view the job as a public servant and caring for the community, compared to a previous focus on the physicality of the recruits and if recruits were able to do the job. So this targeted recruitment does appear to be effective to the extent that the number of applicants has increased, as well as an increase in the hiring of women and Latinx officers. However, we recognize the limits of how generalizable this may be to other departments, considering the four-year degree requirement and high starting salary is above average and rare within the United States. Arlington has also had a consistent promotions process in place and advertises it throughout the department and throughout the organization to ensure that everyone is aware of the promotions available. Similar to changes in recruitment, there is more of an emphasis on officers who participating in external programs available with or that work directly with the community. So one example of this is the Mentoring Arlington Youth program that partners police officers with Arlington Youth to provide guidance and support. However, despite these positive changes that we were able to identify, some participants expressed that promotions were often passed via word of mouth, where only close colleagues are informed about the promotions that may be available. So Arlington should continue to work to ensure that this is limited in order to reduce perceptions of unfairness, that the information is unevenly shared throughout the department. One area of improvement of organizational justice was implemented in the internal affairs process. So Arlington created a more transparent process through the electronic availability of the standard operating procedure for officers, as well as providing brochures that lay out the process for investigations. There was an additional focus within the department on improving officer wellness, in the belief that improvement of an officer's safety and well-being would reduce the number of complaints. For example, they transitioned from a 5-day 8-hour shift to a 4-day 10-hour shift to increase decompression time in the hope that it would decrease sick time and complaints, which it does appear to be related, and they have seen a reduction. They also implemented an early intervention program that alerts the supervisor if a number of incidents occurs within a certain time period, to highlight officers who may be struggling and need more guidance in an effort to reduce officer sick time and injuries. And then finally, we have the defensive tactics area. So in an attempt to improve the perceptions of use of force, the defensive tactics training was overhauled with a focus on using techniques from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well as neuroscience to reduce the amount of force used, while also allowing the officer to maintain perceptions of control. This was done by Arlington in order to make physical interactions with the public more transparent and open, and improve officer safety without relying on physical strength. So Arlington believed that in order to enhance trust within the community, so procedural justice, it was important to have the defensive tactics look better, though it did not connect clearly to organizational justice based on our data collection. However, it's much more focused on how it is viewed by the public. So it should, future reforms should clearly articulate how this improves fairness within the department. as well as if organizational principles are going to be applied on use of force, it's important to apply it to every training area. So departments should consider that even if encounters look better, they may not increase trust within the communities that they serve. So based on our analysis of the various reforms implemented and our focus groups and interviews, we did find that organizational justice reforms were implemented and accepted by employees within the Arlington Police Department. And the successive implementation and acceptance may be due to the fact that Arlington has had consistent leadership. Over the past 3 decades, Arlington has had only 4 police chiefs, which is far fewer than many departments experience in that same time frame. And this has allowed for easier integration of the reforms into different areas as each chief emphasized the importance of fairness and consistency. Arlington also allowed various leaders to create and implement reform ideas, allowing for a more organic approach to the implementation of reforms that disseminated from the upper management down to the rank and file employees. This also allowed leadership to feel responsibility for the success of the reforms and through this top-down dissemination. And it was also encouraged by rank and file officers to come up with ways that may improve organizational justice within the organization, as well as procedural justice within the community. However, we also found that there seemed to be some conceptual confusion of organizational and procedural justice, as the conflation of the terms sometimes led to confusion on what the desired outcomes were for the various reforms we were able to identify. However, despite this, it appears that participants did view Arlington as treating them fairly, which indicates that this conceptual confusion did not affect the department's implementation of reforms. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Anna. We'll move straight on to Zoa Wasim, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Global City Policing, and is going to be talking about the UK arm of the research. Over to you, Zoa.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. Can you see that? Okay, I'm assuming that's fine.
Yeah, we've got that, Zoa.
Okay, great. So thanks, everyone. I'm just going to be building on what Anna presented on, and I'll be discussing findings from our UK case study, so the West Midlands Police, or WMP, and the reform efforts that they have been trying to implement for instilling organizational justice and its principles into the institution of the West Midlands Police. So first, I'm going to begin this presentation with a brief introduction about WMP and the change program that we sought to evaluate, which was the Fairness in Policing program. I will then talk briefly about the methods we used and how we studied organizational change in the WMP and how we evaluated the change process. I will then discuss my findings and analyze some of them before giving some brief recommendations. And I think this will set us up nicely for what Jyoti and Dan will be speaking about in a bit. So the West Midlands Police is one of the largest police departments in the UK, I think the largest outside of London. It comprises of roughly 10,800 employees. Obviously, a majority of these are police officers. And it's sort of in charge of policing a fairly large area. So there's about 8 policing units on NPUs under WMP, and an estimated 2.8 million people live within this area. And in some of the largest cities, which are Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and Coventry, which is also where fieldwork for this, for our side of the project, was carried out. So just to give a brief background on the WMP and this project. So sometime towards late 2016 and 2017, the senior leadership in WMP realized that there was a need to improve perceptions of fairness among its staff and officers. It was understood that perceptions of fairness would generate higher levels of organizational citizenship and satisfaction with the organization. So towards early 2017, the WMP launched what they called the Fairness in Policing, which was a change program that seeks to improve perceptions of internal and external fairness. The aim was to take an inside-out approach for producing a procedurally just and fair police organization by implementing policies, training, and other inputs internally that were aligned with or promoted the idea of organizational justice. And WMP defined organizational justice as the application of these four principles: voice, neutrality, trustworthiness, and dignity and respect inside the organization and within the workplace to nurture and encourage significant people and organizational benefits. So these four principles, the first one, voice, was defined as the opportunity to participate in an issue, a problem, or a conflict by enabling officers to present their suggestions on what should be done and ensuring that officers and staff felt they were heard and therefore felt valued. Neutrality was the idea that of the idea of being balanced and unbiased, as well as honest, impartial, and objective in interaction. Dignity and respect was the recognition and acknowledgement of the dignity of people as members of society and respect for their rights and their status in a society, or in this case, within an organization. And trustworthiness was the recognition that authorities, or in this case, senior leadership, will be benevolent and caring and genuinely concerned about the situation and the needs of officers and staff. And although FIP, I should mention, focuses on both the delivery of organizational and procedural justice, for the purposes of our evaluation, we focus specifically on the delivery of organizational justice. So the primary research questions that were guiding the UK side of evaluation were how is the FIP, how is the project incorporating and implementing principles of organizational justice into WMP practice, and how do officers and staff perceive the changes brought about by the FIP program? So to evaluate the change program and to answer these questions, we carried out qualitative fieldwork in the West Midlands over a period of 5 months between June and November 2019, when the FIP project was in its second year of delivery. Fieldwork was primarily carried out in the cities of Birmingham, Coventry, and Wolverhampton, and a total of 34 police officers and employees participated in our study, and we conducted roughly 24 interviews and 2 focus groups. Participant observation was also carried out in police stations, training centers, during meetings held by administrators of the program, and during promotions processes. The idea behind focus groups and interviews was to evaluate what employees and officers had understood in terms of the concepts of legitimacy, fairness, organizational justice, and procedural justice, to further understand the extent to which these ideas have filtered through the organization. We also studied and evaluated the relevant WMP and FIP documents provided by the WMP that contained extensive information and data about this project and the aims behind it. With this data, we carried out a thematic analysis to identify the themes and patterns and link them back to the principles of organizational justice to see how well they were being integrated within the organization. So we took a joint decision to focus on, as APD did as well, we took a joint decision to focus on 5 key areas or departments within WMP in which the FIP was delivering or was meant to be delivering, to understand how change was taking place within the within these departments. So we selected the professional standards department, promotions, student officer training, strategic leadership training, and TASER training. It should be mentioned that we carried out this evaluation when FIP was still being delivered within the WMP. So it should be acknowledged that the implementation and structure of the program was still evolving and developing when our evaluation was carried out. So what did we find? In terms of PSD or Professional Standards Department, so PSD deals with misconduct complaints and grievances, complaints against officers and grievances of officers. So the FIP team, when designing the change program, found that PSD was performing poorly in terms of timeliness, respect, communication with officers under investigation. The FIP aimed to assist PSD in improving its communication strategies by establishing contact plans between PSD staff and the officers under investigation. The FIP team also helped PSD create contact plans between PSD staff and officers, but also create pathways for receiving feedback from those who were under investigation or going through the PSD. So they helped design feedback forms to give to officers, to give officers a voice, which was one of the principles of organizational justice, to give them a voice. And also they advised that the PSD should have an open door policy to increase perceptions of transparency, and transparency policies were also redrafted along the lines of FIP recommendations. The PSD was also advised to improve its timeliness and speed up the process that deals with officer complaints. Our evaluation found that although PSD had incorporated some of the changes recommended by FIP, resource constraints pose significant challenges in improving PSD service delivery. But by the time the evaluation came to a close, FIP team was still working with PSD. So further evaluation needs to be done to see how the change program is faring in this area now. With regards to promotions, the FIP team was working to weave in principles of fairness into communications and promotions assessments. The FIP also encouraged the promotions team to design and capture candidate feedback at 2 different points following promotions assessments. But the evaluation did not find that whether this feedback from candidates was being reviewed by either the promotions department or by FIP teams. So it was still unclear whether or not these recommendations and changes were translating into promotion-specific policy changes. We found that evidence of organizational justice principles were introduced into promotions assessment exercises, such as interview questions, but it was unclear to what extent these measures were inward-facing and focused on organizational justice as opposed to outward-facing procedural justice. So this also implies some of that conceptual confusion that Anna was talking about earlier between the 2 concepts. And I'll come back to this again in a minute. The next area we looked at was student officer training, which takes place during the onboarding process when new recruits are familiarized with the organization through induction, orientation, and social events. The idea behind including student officer training as part of FIP was to ensure that fairness and organizational justice principles were introduced to student officers through their training material. The FIP therefore helped prepare lesson plans, training material, presentations to ensure that new recruits would have increased awareness and understanding of organizational justice, procedural justice, and legitimacy. So we found that all of these ideas and principles were being delivered to student officers. They were yet to be adequately internalized by these new recruits. There was also, again, some conceptual confusion in this area for new recruits in terms of the difference between fairness in policing and the existing frameworks that were being introduced to them as well, such as the Code of Ethics. So the next area we looked at was the strategic leadership training, which covers all the training that's provided to senior police officers, so superintendent and above. And the training generally covers, material on how to become good leaders and deals with leadership styles, etc. But the SLT, or strategic leadership training, is a component that was fairly new within WMP, and it had a separate philosophy guiding it, which was called the leadership promise, which complemented the principles of fairness in policing. But at the same time, it was unclear to what extent FIP had brought about any changes within the SLT. So this particular area also needs further evaluation and research. So TASER training, for TASER training, FIP team designed and delivered specific lessons and presentations for officers that were undergoing a 3-day training course at WMP. The principles of organizational justice and procedural justice were introduced to officers who were undergoing TASER training, but we could not find any evidence at the time that we conducted our evaluation to suggest that these inputs and lessons were influencing officer behavior. The idea behind evaluating change in TASER training was to see whether the introduction of organizational justice principles influenced behavioral change on the part of officers, but such an evaluation would require more time and a longer study. So how can we analyze some of these findings? So as I mentioned, FIP was in its 2nd year of delivery when we conducted our evaluation. We found that the project vision and delivery had evolved over the past 2 years. So initially it was a standalone project, and then later over time it was merged under another department, which was the Diversity and Inclusion Department. This was to ensure that FIP was delivered more organically and horizontally throughout the organization, but we need further research and more time to find out whether this merger was successful in delivering organizational justice and change and changes across the institution. We also find that the change was perceived more strongly by officers in or around the city and the headquarters in Birmingham. Its impact outside Birmingham was felt less strongly, And as I mentioned earlier, this is the second largest, or I think the second largest force in the UK. So delivering programmatic change in an institution of this size will naturally take time. So perhaps it was too early to assess its horizontal impact across the West Midlands. We saw that the strongest influence of the change program was the professional standards department and the promotions area, which I think was natural because these were the two areas that were recognized initially as needing, as mostly needing or needing more than others, the introduction of organizational justice principles. The interventions that involved a training component, so strategic leadership training or TASER training, etc., they showed little evidence of impact because of the change program. We also found some conceptual confusion between organizational justice and procedural justice, as Anna mentioned earlier, but also they were complicated by the fact that the existing frameworks were dealing with very similar concepts, such as the leadership promise or the code of ethics. So that probably complicated the delivery of the program as well. And although so going forward, I think we need more efforts to be made to have clearer distinctions between organizational justice and procedural justice. So we recommend that there be some clarity behind the objectives and concepts that are underscoring a change program. Our report also recommends that senior leadership continues supporting the change program and that there be continuity in the way the team delivers a program till corporate and institutional memory develops. Once the principles are institutionalized, the program can then be handed over, or it can then be organically merged into other areas and departments. We also found, I should mention, that some officers felt patronized by the way the change program was being delivered because they felt there was an assumption that they were not being fair or they were being unfair to their colleagues and citizens. So we recommend that a change program such as this should be packaged and delivered in a more careful and better manner, so the messaging behind a program and its interventions, they're not condescending or patronizing in any way. So I'll stop here now and I'll hand over to Jyoti. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Zoha. Yeah, so straight on to the next speaker, who is Jyoti Bulush, Associate Professor with us at UCL. And I guess the aim is now to draw some of those threads together. Over to you, Jyoti.
Thank you, Ben. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Is that sharing?
Yeah, we've got that, Jyoti.
Thanks. Okay, thank you, Zoha. And Anna, I think the details of the work that was carried out in both these departments were very clearly presented. What I'd like to do is just reflect more broadly on some of the findings in terms of the bigger picture and talk about some of the broader implications of implementing organizational change on the scale that both APD and WMP have aspired to in this program, and to some extent are succeeding. Whether the intervention is sustainable or not, or whether it's yielding the results it hopes to, is a matter for longer term evaluation. So I think we need to make clear at the outset that this was much more of a process evaluation rather than an impact evaluation, simply because of the timescales involved and the fact that this program was being rolled out and we in WMP, and we sort of did this work in the middle of that rollout. So I'm going to talk about sort of three basic areas that are out here on this slide, which is the theory of change and its importance for organizational justice reform of this scale. So the basic premise of the organizational justice program was the logic that the better police officers are trained by their own organization, the more likely they are to treat the public with that kind of fairness, with respect, and which is why the link between organizational justice and procedural justice was understood. So improve conditions, treat officers with respect within the organization, and they are set up to go out and do the same with the public that they interact with. So when we talk about a theory of change basically is just trying to figure out how, so it was much more of a theory-driven evaluation and try to sort of draw out the link between how we think this program of change is going to bring about the desired outcomes. It's basically just a series of steps to show what kind of resources are being put in, what kind of activities are being undertaken by the organization in order to achieve certain set objectives or outcomes. So the inputs in this particular model are the resources, the roadmaps, the planning, and all the activities that are required for the delivery of this change program. Outputs are the activities undertaken in the pursuit of that, of achieving those outcomes. Outcomes are of two types. They are both interim outcomes and final outcomes. And impacts are the wider systemic changes that we hope that will come about as a result of the changes. So if you look at this, it's the first three steps are to bring about some of the more internal facing outcomes for officers so that they feel that they're treated fairly. And that sets them up to externally convert that fairness and respect in their behavior and their interactions with citizens outward. So that's the link between procedural justice and organizational justice. When we tried to come up with a specific theory of change that was driving the programs in both these police departments, we found that each department needed its own specific theory of change, which was linking up what they were intending to do and how they were going about it in order to achieve the specific outcomes that they wanted. So this was sort of an initial or a work in progress theory of change that came that we sort of devised at the end of our research, and it tries to look at how WMP or the West Midlands Police was introducing their very programmatic change program for their organizational or fairness in policing project. So here we're looking at some of the inputs that are required. The outputs are the activities that are undertaken by the police, by WMP in order to achieve some of these outcomes. And the 5 areas where they started this program were discussed by Zoha. What's really important is that there have to be a set of key assumptions which we have identified both internally, factors that need to be present internally as well as externally in order to ensure that the program of change delivers its promise. The evaluation, and I cannot stress the importance enough of a theory of change, simply because what we did find, and as some of the findings reported by Zoha and Anna showed, that a number of interventions were introduced in these police departments. For example, promotions. If there was a perception that promotions were a source of discontent, then a number of interventions were introduced to improve the promotions process. However, the need for a theory of changes becomes apparent when some of these interventions are no doubt intended to improve the promotions process, but were not exactly targeted to address those issues that were causing that discontent. So things were introduced that made the promotions process better, but why people were feeling aggrieved was not really addressed. So a much more problem-solving approach is what we recommend should be adopted. If specific aspects of the promotion process are causing discontent, then the interventions need to be targeted to address those issues. And we found sometimes there was a mismatch between what was needed and what was actually introduced. And actually having logic models that trace the link between the input, the activities of the organization and how those outcomes are achieved or not would be a much more targeted and strategic way to approach the organizational justice change program. Now, our evaluation these are terms borrowed very, very loosely from the realistic evaluation approach that Pawson and Tilley talk about. But we tried to understand how the context of an organization or the context within which an organization operates, how it interacts with the kind of change program it adopts, and what kinds of outcomes, therefore, might or might not be achieved. So looking at the context, we found that between the two organizations, although they were aiming to bringing about similar outcomes, it was very much the size of the organization that was vastly different. We saw that APD is a much smaller department covering a small area with a workforce that isn't very large as compared to WMP, which is a much larger organization covering a wide area with 40,000 plus employees. It makes it a very different kind of organization where change program has to be planned and brought into fruition. It was not just the size, but the structure of the organization. So WMP had more generalists. Everyone was pitching in, whereas WMP was organized far more strategically, far more targeted, specific units for specific activities. And so there was less generalist kind of practice going on in WMP as compared to the targeted approach taken in WMP. We also found that the impetus for why exactly the organizational change program was being rolled out made a huge difference to the way in which it would be rolled out. So whether the impetus came from within the leadership, from within the organization itself, or whether it was imposed or expected from external factors that were driving this change program, made a difference to the way in which it would be rolled out. Similarly, senior leadership buy-in made a huge difference to the way in which the program started and continued being rolled out. So in APD, there was, for example, huge senior leadership buy-in, and there was sustained interest and support to the program. Things in WMP were far more dynamic and fluid, and senior leadership buy-in, though in theory remained strong, it kind of changed as resourcing, as conditions changed in WMP. And that again makes a difference to the way in which the program is conceived and rolled out. Resources, I don't need to labor much on that particular point. We all know if a program of this ambition has to be rolled out properly, it needs adequate resourcing, it needs adequate planning, and the old chestnut of organizational culture. I mean, we bang on about it, but it makes a huge difference as we realized in both these organizations. It's the culture that is the substratum which drives or raises barriers or obstacles to how change program is rolled out in these two, and indeed in any organization that wants to bring about such a ambitious program. And this kind of affected the way in which the program was rolled out. So our observation, just sort of from a distance, seemed to be that the APD change program was sort of much more organic, much more emergent, much more diffused. It could be as a result of the contextual factors, but WMP, given its size, given the scale at which it had to be rolled out, was a far more programmatic and planned and top-down sort of change program. So the model by which this organizational justice program was rolled out was different, and they both have their advantages and disadvantages. It's difficult to say which is better or worse. It kind of pretty much depends on the context and the outcomes that that the organization would want to achieve. And finally, when we think about outcomes, you have interim outcomes and final outcomes, and some of the conceptual confusion that both Anna and Zoha were talking about in terms of organizational justice and procedural justice sort of played out in terms of the outcomes that both these organizations were trying to achieve. So I think it was doubtless that in both the organizations, the end result that was desired was much more application of procedural justice. And organizational justice was an interim step, or a step to assist landing of the procedural justice agenda. And therefore, often when interventions were introduced as part of the organizational justice program, they were actually interventions aimed at achieving procedural justice outcomes. And it was this mismatch between, we want people to be treated fairly, so we will introduce PJOJ principles in training, but that actually wasn't improving the organizational justice within the organization itself, or at least there wasn't clear evidence that it was bringing about a change in the organizational justice within the organization. And so that kind of clarity of what outcomes are we trying to achieve, and therefore what interventions do we need to put into place, would come if these programs were underpinned by a very clear theory of change and logic models for each of the intervention that the organization was trying to introduce. So going forward, as I said, the theory of change and logic models are really important to ensure that your program is landing in the manner to achieve the outcomes you want to achieve. And that means you need greater conceptual clarity between interventions intended to achieve these two different kinds of, different but linked justice programs. The importance of sustained support for a project of this kind cannot be stressed enough. It's not an easy program. It cannot be rolled out overnight. It takes time. In APD, it's been going on for several years, and it has had that support throughout this period. Similarly, WMP needs to have the sustained support that it requires for this project to roll out. And finally, I mean, this was a process evaluation. Whether their efforts have been successful or not, we do need medium to long-term impact evaluations to be commissioned, to be carried out regularly to see whether this works or not. That's all I had to say. Thanks, Ben. I'll hand it back to you now. I hope I've kept to time.
You have. I was just about to say admirable timekeeping, Jyoti. Admirable timekeeping. Right, and now for the interesting bit. Now we're going to hand over to two police officers, one from each department, who are not only involved in delivering these change programs within their organisations, but actually I think also fair to say quite closely involved with this research process as well. So the first speaker here is Dan Popple. He's an inspector of West Midlands Police. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Ben. Firstly, I just want to say thank you for everyone involved in this. It was a great opportunity. I learned a lot. I found the whole experience to be really enjoyable, eye-opening, and allowed me to meet some really fantastic people in the UK and the USA. We still speak quite regularly over in the USA, and we sort of communicate around what's going on in policing on both sides of the pond. A lot of the evaluation that was conducted actually took place, probably the work related to prior to my time on the Fairness in Policing team. So I really want to talk about some of the practical challenges and how the collaboration, which is continued beyond that evaluation, I might add, has influenced our work today. So I joined the Fairness in Policing team in October 2018, where it was a project, it was structured, it was systematic. And the idea was that over time, we'd engage with every department and do a top and tail approach to sort of procedural justice and organisational justice. Now, in around December 2018, there were some high-level discussions to bring fairness in policing in line with the D&I strategy. And that was because there were some very similar ambitions that we wanted to achieve. Just to be clear though, even though we went into the D&I strategy, we still called ourselves the Fairness in Policing team. I think to this day, I regard myself as a D&I manager with a special interest on fairness in policing and police legitimacy. Just to give you some context then, so where we now stand and how we try and deliver some of the work is that we have a 4-part to our strategy. We like to try and build an inclusive culture, which is those internal focus to drive fairness. But at the same time, because it's D&I, we are looking at things that are compliant with the Equality Act legislation. We look to try and build an inclusive leadership. We look to have fair representation, which I think many people in the room will know that legitimacy and representation and people wanting to join the police are probably going to have some close links now. So we want to make sure that the work we do around legitimacy has some impact on how we do our recruitment. And the final one, which is around the inclusive services, which is very much, I suppose, around the focus of external and how we're perceived by the communities. So any good D&I plan will have a focus on how we look after our communities. And this is where I think a lot of the procedural justice, a lot of the police legitimacy work sits in this arena. So the original fairness in policing model produced some really excellent work. There was a lot of stuff that now there's still a legacy today, and we needed to be in a place to try and continue that work. But UCL's arrival was really timely for us in helping us shape what that was going to look like going forward. So I was kind of fortunate to have academic expert on hand to provide their skills and experiences to build my knowledge and also look at what happened previously and how we can work on it. I suppose even at that early stage, we'd done a couple of inputs, me and my colleague, and there was a couple of things that I wasn't sure about. One, we had concerns about how some of the theory and some of the language was landing with operational officers. We were told at a particular one input that it was patronising, which was a bit of a shock because we thought we were trying to deliver it in a really sort of fair way, ironically. We needed to know whether the work was continuing once FIP had moved away. And that's something I'll talk on in a bit really, but you know, was it still happening? Did it need us to be there? What happens if we kind of pulled away? And also the final one is, how should the team look now we've merged into D&I, and what does that governance structure look like? So the report and the work that's come out of it, some of the key learning really, or the key points I want to talk about, which I think is important in terms of getting this right. The first one was the governance, and I think it was highlighted the governance was a bit confusing. At the time, we had a leadership promise, we had a people deal, we have our 4 reasoning values, we had code of ethics. So there was a lot of things sort of playing out there, and it did get a little bit confusing. Apologies. So where are we now then? Well, a lot of our fairness in policing work is driven through our D&I board. What we've been lucky in the last 12 months or so is we've had real top level support. So our chief constable is very much on board with this, but our D&I board is now chaired by our deputy chief constable, who's the second highest officer in our force. And she drives this agenda and she makes sure it's on track. Now, every single department, and there's over 30 of them now within West Mids, all have a local D&I plan. So this is how we try to drive some of the local initiatives, because what's suitable, say, for frontline officers may not necessarily be suitable for finance department or people that work in the call handling. So this allows for that local sort of aspect to be looked at. I think, as Joyce described, we need to find a way of just looking at a local level. We also have D&I subgroups now, which allow for some of those discussions and sharing of information. So again, if there's some good work going on in learning and development, we can potentially go and share that with call handling around what they're doing. And one example of that was we had recently developed a concept known as a brave space, where we talk about issues within our teams, and that's kind of like evolved and moved across all different departments now. We felt it was important to continue the name Fairness in Policing and not to lose that. We do offer something in the organisation which is different compared to other elements of D&I, which is very much focused on the Equality Act and things like positive action. So the next point I think that came out of the work was officers reporting that confusing language, and it did come out. The study showed that people just find it too technical, too academic. So we've made sure that in the future we keep that language simple. We use existing terminology, which is trying to achieve the same outcomes. And what I mean by that is, in policing, we use things like rapport building when we deal with our victims or when we deal with things like negotiators. So actually, let's jump on that type of language, which is already established. Why do I need to bring in a concept or jargon or language which maybe is going to be too alien for some people? Let's keep it to what we already know. I often explain, when I do engage with people and I do talk to departments, I still make sure I talk about procedural justice. I still think it's really important that behind however we deliver this, there is that science that sits behind there to explain exactly what we're doing, why procedural justice matters, the concepts around values and engagement on the street and legitimacy. So I think that's really important. What I do say though is whatever we do, the science is there. However we produce that, the tool needs to be different and needs to be relevant. So again, what I do is I make sure the department takes the lead. So if they want to come to me and say, we'd like to do some work around call handling training, I make sure they take the lead, they engage with their staff, they do what's important to them, and I just provide that context where I can. An example of that we had recently was with Project Guardian, which is our initiative to reduce knife crime. They wanted to do some work around stop and search. And again, it was really nice that they did a lot of training around rapport building. They did, and what one of their key aspects now is to try and reduce or try and improve how we interact with things like stop and search. My input was very minimal really, but it was just setting that guide and saying, this is what's important to us, this is what's important to the public, now what can we do to deliver on that? So another thing that came out of the report was too much planning, lack of focus, and we've talked about that. So whilst we're strictly not a project anymore, I do try and manage it now, I think based on that advice, in a project format. It's been important to achieve that by getting small pieces of work and actually try and deliver on small pieces of work. Now, I've been lucky and fortunate to get my head around the logic model, so I try to use that as much as I can. And everything we try and do is to identify the problem, try and find the response, and then do our outputs and outcomes. It just gives us that focus. I think in the past, when I first started the job, I was a little bit overwhelmed by this. And my advice would be keep it structured, keep it in a kind of that format, and use the logic model where you can. So the work now that the Fairness in Policing team does is a little bit different to what we did before. So we didn't necessarily do this sort of department approach anymore. What we do is we have force level initiatives and priorities we're looking at. At the moment, we're looking at stop and search, where we're trying to develop approaches to improve the way we do stop and search by looking at things like debriefs using reflective practice. And we want to use reflective practice because we feel it's about the officer understanding what they've done and how they've embraced it to try and bring in those organisational justice elements. What we don't want to do is just go and do a PowerPoint presentation to 6,000 police officers and say, off you go and learn how to do fair stop and searches. We don't think that's the right approach. And we've been quite keen to make sure we're not just going on that route of just doing a presentation and walking away. Use of force, well, we're looking at things like really driving de-escalation training. And again, looking at debriefs and looking at how we can do things better, using more of that reflective practice, seeing whether someone could have maybe started doing some de-escalation themselves better. We have another push on citizen satisfaction because we believe that we really need to develop a large program aimed at understanding our satisfaction. I think we talk about outcomes a lot today, and I think in past policing, there's been surveys here and there, but we really want to drive that citizen satisfaction, understanding from whether it's our victims, whether it's the people who use police powers. We want to make sure we understand whether that was a good experience. So we got that learning, and our drive is really to become a truly a learning organisation, so we can make sure we do things better for the public in the future. We are doing some work around disproportionality. I think it's very topical at the moment. Organisationally, we're trying to understand where we have disproportionality with CJS systems, victims, police powers, and also then trying to identify the gaps in our data so we can then try and fill those gaps and understand it. And that will lead to some more work. That does fit under the umbrella of fairness in policing, coming away from the procedural justice side of stuff particularly, but I think it's an important aspect to talk about. So in the other areas that particularly now we look at, and the benefit of being part of the D&I team now is that we have the expertise from the D&I departments. So some of the things that we have in the UK, so quality impact assessments, reasonable adjustments, these are things that sit within our Quality Act, which actually fall within the fairness for the organisational justice. Because some of the complaints we had from our members of staff were, I'm not being treated fairly due to my disability. Well, that's really important. And if we don't get it right, it's illegal. So we have to make sure we're getting that aspect right and treating everyone fairly. Equality impact assessments just allow us to start looking at some of those wider pieces. And what we've done with ours is actually added questions into our EIAs, which are around legitimacy. So is what we're doing actually not just thinking about the protected characteristics, are we thinking about legitimacy and the impact it might have on the community, the way we do stuff? What's the historical context of that community like? And how is this type of work going to impact on that? And the other things we're starting to do is look at things like fair recruitment process. Again, some of the feedback from officers are that they weren't seeing that fair recruitment process. They felt that, so the internal process, they felt that if they put an application form in, they weren't getting the right sort of consistency. So we're helping to make sure those type of processes are occurring. And the final part of our sort of tiering system there is the local departments, which I have briefly touched on. I said we have almost 30 different departments across the force, and each one has their own bespoke piece of work that they'll try and develop, whether it's internal or externally focused. So for force contact, for example, I'm supporting them with their training. Learning development, we're helping them with their student officer training, looking at some of their research they've done, and some of the local police, and we look at some of the youth engagement work. But all departments, as I said, are looking at some of their brave spaces, some of their focus groups to understand the issues on their team. I just want to talk about the challenges I still face, really, I think, with the work. It's fair to say police culture, in its broadest sense, is still very difficult. Talking about fairness to officers sometimes can be a difficult subject. I think a lot of police officers, pride themselves on being fair, and that's a fair comment. I think most officers, most of the time, do their very best and try their very best. So it is a difficult conversation sometimes. Some of the issues around our size of the organisation as well, I know we've talked about that. West Midlands Police is a big organisation. There's 6,000 police officers and about 4,000 more police staff. So we have to, the process we did was around trying to have a system that didn't rely on me talking to 10,000 people. It was about going to that person who's in charge of that department and filtering it down. And that was important to keep the momentum going. We want that momentum to keep going as well, because one of the things we find in policing is we do have a turnover of staff. I think it's very cultural within policing to move on and get promoted. And so things like PSD, for example, since they had their involvement with fairness in policing, they've actually had a new head of department, 2 new chief inspectors have come in. So these are the challenges we were facing. How do we keep this going? And this is why we think now that the fairness in policing, the D&I collaboration is actually really effective and can keep that momentum going with our support. The one thing I will add is just a final thoughts really in our trip to Arlington. So obviously part of this work was to experience the work over in Texas. People often say to me that policing in the USA is very different to the UK. And of course there are some aspects which is true. But when I got there, what I did find was there was huge commitment from the police officers. And we just had that connection. It was natural, the way we talked, the way we sort of experienced things. And the challenges they had were very similar as well. We came over, there was still domestic incidents occurring, there was still robberies, and there was still some really great community policing going on, and that was really, really nice to see. And I went away from the USA thinking, do you know what, I think we see things in policing in the USA very, very different to the UK. We think they're very different, but I think fundamentally our principles and our values are the same. One of the key things I'll say, and just to conclude really, is what I loved about Arlington, what they did and what we've learned from them, is that example with the PST and the self-defense training. They went away, they looked at it in a localized situation, said, what was it we can do to make this fairer? And I loved that. And I don't know if Professor Mike Sharner's on the call today, but he said these words to me once. He said, if legitimacy was your top priority, what would you do differently? And that's the motto now we use in West Midlands Police. We put it back onto the departments. We say, what can you do differently in your department? Because this is the way we're going to go now. Thank you very much. Cheers, Ben.
Thanks, Dan. Absolutely fascinating. But the one thing that I always take home from that is the importance of language when you're talking to police officers, and how important it is to choose your words correctly. And last but absolutely not least, we have Lieutenant Chris Caldwell to give us the view from Arlington, Texas. Chris.
Thank you, Ben. And I want to echo the thoughts the same as Dan, that very blessed to be part of this project, blessed that my organization allowed me to be part of this project, and I feel like I have some lifelong friendships as a result of it. One obviously being Dan. We communicate all the time and run ideas across each other routinely. I feel like I'm going to keep mine much more brief than Dan, and that's not a shot at my counterpart there, but he had a lot of wonderful information, but the way we rolled out our program as opposed to them, they have a standalone unit. So I think moving forward, especially in the challenging times of 2020 with COVID, I think maybe they still have opportunity to create new trainings, new programs where we are still looking at that, but we're somewhat status quo. But I'll start. I think what we've learned, and we've learned many things over the last few years, not only having the opportunity to do the exchange program and site visits with the West Midlands PD in the UK, but also through our involvement in relationships built with the research team. A great takeaway from our interactions has been that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to implementing and sustaining a procedural justice or organizational justice program or efforts within an organization. With that, this program, quite frankly, forced me and some of my colleagues to get out of our comfort zone and look at procedural justice and organizational change through a different lens, if you will. I've been one of our subject matter experts and lead trainers in procedural justice since 2013, and it's continued to grow and develop. But oftentimes in policing, we get stuck in our own thoughts, and I appreciate the researchers and the team from the UK to broaden my thoughts. And but anyway, I think that an organization needs to determine what works best for them, and then just move forward with it. Just feel out what they think might work within their organization, and then you got to go for it. So obviously, as stated by Anna earlier in the program, the Arlington Police Department here in Texas, we took a broader, more holistic approach, beginning with our core values and implementing them into several processes throughout the organization. She mentioned some of those processes, and I'll go over them one more time, but some of those were through our policies, our discipline system, our hiring, and arguably most importantly, our training. And within that is also our defensive tactics training. It was a huge part of our implementation because it gave us the opportunity to touch the entire workforce. We did a top-down approach, even through our training, but we made it intentional. We brought everybody in, and we facilitated the training, and then we continue to do so with new employees, both commissioned peace officers and our professional staff. With onboarding training, they still get procedural justice training today. And I'll echo some of the thoughts by Zoha during her research from the UK, that some of the officers were resistant to it. Maybe they felt like they were being patronized, or that we as leaders in the organization or as trainers were telling them that they weren't trustworthy, or they didn't have that trust with the community. That's not isolated to the thoughts of maybe some officers over in the UK. We dealt with the same. And that's why we told our officers, arguably the people that need this training the most are arguably the most resistant to it. So we made it intentional for our entire workforce. And I think it worked well. So though we began to institutionalize procedural justice within the entire organization, over time, procedural justice became part of our organizational culture. And Jyoti talked about that when we talk about organizational culture, because in our research and training, we talk about climate versus culture. A climate of an organization or a specific work group can change. It can change with leadership. It can change with new employees, but we felt like if it became part of our organizational culture, then it would be sustainable. Quite frankly, we feel like procedural justice and the principles of procedural justice are woven into the fabric of the Arlington Police Department. And then again, once it becomes part of the organizational culture, it's sustainable to a level that will remain regardless of several factors, including and arguably most important, leadership. And we're dealing with that currently. I don't know if everybody knows this, but the Arlington Police Department is going through changes from the top. Chief Will Johnson retired last year, and he was a huge champion of procedural justice efforts within our organization and nationally, and arguably globally. And he retired last year and moved on to different ventures in his life. And we're currently, we welcomed our new Chief Al Jones. who officially began leading our organization last week. So I'm excited about what our future holds, and I'm positive that with the work that we have done and the principles of procedural justice, that it will remain part of our core values. And I'm hopeful that we continue to seek out new innovative ways to engage our workforce and continue to build relationships with the community with all of these values in mind. And more importantly, because I think at the end of the day, we need to build relationships with all people within our community. I think oftentimes we take for granted that we have supporters, such as, we have a police and clergy program here at Arlington, and we do Coffee with a Cop, and it's the same people that show up over and over. I think as we move forward, we'll continue to try to build relationships with more of the underserved populations, because we just should not build relationships with folks that support the police. We need to build those with those that may not support us as well. So at the end of the day, 2020 has been a challenging year for everybody, not just here in Arlington, Texas, but around the world. Our efforts have remained strong. We continue to look at policy and procedures. We're hiring new recruits on a weekly basis, and we're continuing to focus on the procedural justice philosophies and principles as we do that. As Anna stated earlier, we really want to focus on officers and hire officers that have a servant's heart, that want to serve. We're not just always looking for the biggest, fastest, strongest, as we did historically. But training was the most hard hit. With COVID, our training has been the hardest hit by far. But we're continuing to develop, and we look forward to a rollout as we move forward with new principles and the results of this program as well, to introduce our officers to that. It's just right now we can do some online stuff, but again, with policing being relational, we really want to do in-person training. So that has not really made any strides this year because of 2020. But overall, we look back to getting some sense of normalcy soon. And so we can continue to move forward with this. So that's all I have today. I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be part of this project. And I look forward to it moving forward and seeing where we go from here. So thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to all the speakers.